Hello and welcome to Extreme Tourism Part 2. Today's focus is on the case study that you need to be aware of for the 8-mark questions, and this case study is Antarctica. The specification requirements state a case study of one extreme area and the extent to which it can cope with the development of the tourist industry is required. So, the focus of this session is to know the location, the reasons why it's an extreme environment, the impacts and the strategies that are being used in Antarctica to cope with the increase in tourism. So firstly, where is Antarctica located? So it is a continent at the South Pole. It's actually the 5th largest continent, covering an area of 14 million kilometres squared, and this is almost 60 times bigger than the UK. It's the largest body of fresh water on Earth and contains 91% of the world's ice and 70% of its fresh water. So that's its location. So any 8-mark question should always start with a sentence giving a clear location of your case study. Next, we need to consider why Antarctica is an extreme tourist environment. So it's the world's most remote, inaccessible, highest, coldest, driest continent, and it's surrounded by the stormy Southern Ocean. To take each of those characteristics separately and give you a little bit more detail is what's going to follow now. So remoteness. South America is the nearest continent, but that is over 1,000 kilometres away. Its inaccessibility comes down to the fact that it has no commercial airports. There are a few landing places, but due to the weather conditions, these are not always available. The only real way to visit is a minimum of a 2-day voyage across the Southern Ocean from South America, and that then lands at the Antarctic Peninsula. And the season for visiting is very narrow due to the austral summer. Okay, so most of the time the ice does not permit it. It's the highest continent in the world with an average 2,300 metres in altitude, and the highest mountain is Vison Massif, which rises to a height of 4,897 metres. There's also the Transantarctic Mountains stretching across Antarctica as well. It's considered to be the coldest continent, with the mean temperatures inland varying from minus 40 degrees Celsius to minus 70 degrees Celsius. And that's in the coldest month, and then in the warmest month, minus 1 degrees Celsius to minus 35 degrees Celsius. So it's extremely cold. And this is made worse by the powerful winds, which can reach up to 300 kilometres per hour. The Southern Ocean, which surrounds Antarctica as well, is also very stormy, and during the winter months it freezes for hundreds of kilometres offshore, therefore hindering the accessibility of it as well. Next thing to focus on is the idea of how tourism in Antarctica has developed over time. So like the case study on Blackpool, where we considered why tourism had increased, you need to have a basic awareness of why Antarctica has developed over time. So just a couple of headline features. In 1956, there were 66 tourists that visited by aircraft from Chile. In 1958, 2 separate cruises started to take fare-paying passengers from Chile and Argentina to the South Shetland Islands. That was about a total of 500. In 1970s, flight seeing started by Qantas Airline. However, this was short-lived because in 1979 there was an accident. 257 passengers died, so flight seeing was cancelled for a while. In 1991, due to successive increases in tourism, the IAATO was formed by 7 tour operators, and this was a code of conduct, and it's voluntary, that people signed up to try and support tourism and to not damage the environment. I'll come back to that later and talk about the strategies. Then you've got a couple more changes, but in 1999 to 2001 you had almost 15,000 people visiting, and 2000 to 2001, 12,250 visitors between November 2000 and March 2001. So in the pre-release pack, you've got a timeline of the changes, and you can clearly see how tourism has become increasingly important in Antarctica, and as a result, this is going to have knock-on effects. Who visits Antarctica? There's a statement that some people have kind of talked about, or your teacher may have mentioned in your previous lesson, in that extreme environment tourism are just adventures for the rich and elite. The data shown for 2007 to 2008 does actually conform to this, in that your USA contributes 16,533 tourists for this season, whereas the UK was 7,372 and Germany was 5,090 people. So for those top 3 countries, providing tourists to Antarctica, these are associated with MEDC or HIC countries, so rich countries. So that does suggest that maybe this statement could be true. However, always remember to evaluate the evidence. That's for 1 year. The next thing to consider is the tourist attractions of Antarctica. So you've been suggested to look at a number of clips which will help you with what attractions are available in Antarctica and give you good visual evidence, but just ones to be aware of. Whale and penguin watching. Okay, so Antarctica attracts lots of people to go watch the penguins, and people go on penguin safari photo shoots. You've got ice trekking and climbing, the Vissel Massif. You've got glacier walking, kayaking, cross-country skiing, cold water diving, and you can visit the old whaling stations where they used to shoot the whales out in the water, so harpoon them, and they used to then cut them up in these whaling stations, and then sell their fat and their blubber to go in cosmetics and to go with the whale bones with the corsets. Obviously that's stopped now. But the whaling stations are there, and some people, it's part of their tour that they like to go see, to see how the things were done, so it's kind of historical tourism. Okay, trends in tourism, so I've already addressed that slightly, but the number of ships is increasing, which will bring its own problems. Okay, so last focus on Antarctica is the impacts of tourists visiting and how these impacts can be minimised. So firstly, Antarctica is signed up. There's an Antarctic Treaty. Okay, so this is an international agreement that came into force in 1961 and has been signed by 47 countries. In this agreement, the main focus is designed to protect and conserve the environment and its animal and plant life. And tourism wasn't initially in it. So in 1991, the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, IAATO, was set up to regulate tourism in Antarctica. Now, they devised a code of conduct in which there are a number of criteria by which the tour operators should operate, but the code is voluntary and people didn't have to sign up to it, but most tour operators have, and they do abide by it. So one of the key strategies for maintaining tourism and reducing the impacts of tourism is the development of this strategy. So you need to know the name of it. So it's 1991, it was the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, IAATO, that devised this code of conduct. So taking the impacts, there are a lot of impacts. I've limited down to 4, and then those 4 impacts then have a subsequent strategy that's been put to them to try and control it. So because it's likely that a question could be describe a problem and suggest a strategy to combat it. Okay, probably not in those words, but they're usually linked. So that's what I've tried to do in this pre-release. Okay, so the first problem is that the number of ships travelling to Antarctica is increasing. So this increases the risk of pollution by oil spills, and if this gets into the water, this could have a knock-on effect on the food chain, because it could affect the mollusks, which then can have an effect on the fish and carry on up the food chain with the penguins, etc., and the whales. So to reduce this risk, the number of cruise vessels visiting each area of the Antarctic at any one time has been capped to only 40, and only one vessel is allowed to land at a particular site. Okay, so that's to reduce the number of ships accessing the area. Also, the number of people on the ships are limited to only 500 passengers, and there are a maximum of 100 people that are allowed on shore at any time. So by limiting the number of tourists that can visit, this is limiting the number of ships that are in the Antarctic waters, and as a result this reduces the risk of oil pollution. Also reduces the risk of overusing the land, so just by trampling of vegetation and walking on the landing sites. The second major impact is increasing numbers of tourists bring with it more litter, more waste, more sewage effluent. So as a result, the dumping of waste in the sea or on land in Antarctica is totally forbidden, and ships have specialist waste disposal equipment on board, and basically it's disposed of safely when we're outside the Antarctica waters. There's also a commercial air flight company, Antarctic Logistic and Expeditions, ALE, that are responsible for removing any waste actually on Antarctica itself from tourist sites and from the scientific bases. So having such strict controls on removing the waste means that the waste won't get into the food chain, so it won't have negative effects and it won't impact on the ecosystem. Number 3, the tourists, they want to visit the most picturesque and wildlife-rich areas, so this results in them becoming a honeypot site. So honeypot sites typically get destroyed and ruined unless they're properly managed. Also, because people keep going back to the same sites, this can have a negative impact on the animals. For example, penguins, not used to being touched and in close proximity to people, could choose to leave their young and abandon their eggs. So, to combat this, there are certain areas that have been designated sites of special scientific interest, such as Bird Island on South Georgia, and people are not allowed to access these areas, and so it's conserving this environment for the protection of the species. The IAATO has also produced tourist guides, which give advice to tourists on not to feed, touch or handle birds or the seals, or approach or photograph them in ways that could cause them to alter their behaviour. Okay, and these so tourists are given these on the ships and read them, and they're there to abide by them. Number 4, the scientists based in Antarctica. There's quite a few research stations there, and that's part of the Antarctic Treaty. They're finding that they're spending quite a lot of their time and money on search and rescue and medical support due to increase in tourists. So tourists not following the guidelines, going off track, or putting themselves in difficult situations with the adventure activities they're doing. As a result, this is then causing the money to be lost rather than on focus on research, it's on focus on tourism. So, tourists are encouraged to plan and use quality equipment and only use trained personnel when doing the activities. In 2009, the Antarctic Treaty members set a ratio requirement of 1 guide for every 20 visitors to reduce this problem, and they were trained guides. Also, this reduces the need for the scientific personnel to be used. Okay, so there's 4 main impacts of tourist numbers increasing in Antarctica, and then I've given you the 4 kind of main strategies to reduce this. Okay, so it's a good idea to try and learn the 4 strategies next to the 4 impacts so that they can go together. Okay, and finally, there is a good thing about tourists going to Antarctica, is that because of global warming, the ice sheets are melting, or the evidence does suggest it's melting. So by going to Antarctica themselves, tourists are able to observe firsthand the effects of this, not just on the ice, but also on the animals and the landscape and the ecosystems that exist there. So having seen it for themselves, they go back and they're strong advocates of a sense of the right for people to do something about it, so conserve energy and reduce the problem associated with global warming. Okay, so that's the positive impact. So if you're asked the question on what are the impacts of tourism to Antarctica, don't forget the positive. Okay, so in an 8-mark question, okay, you need to structure into positive and negative, and that's your one positive that you need to focus on. Okay, so having watched this clip, read for the information, there are a number of tasks on the pre-release document that you need to complete, and you need to make sure that you're aware of the expectations for the lesson that link to this video clip. Okay, feel free to watch as many times as you need. This is your case study. It's very important that you know the specific details as outlined in this video clip. Thank you very much.